Hello and welcome to Chapter 20, Global Financial Architecture. First of all, we do some foreign exchange regimes, and this really is international economics, and I teach it in my international economics course for those of you who haven't done international economics already. So when we look at exchange rates, they can be organized in different ways. And this is called exchange rate policy. So given that you have an exchange rate, obviously you do, presumably, any country would do if it has its own currency, you can organize your exchange rate policy in different ways. So, the exchange rate is essentially whatever policy you have. It's determined by market forces, and exchange rates are extremely volatile and they change on a very frequent basis. We say when a currency falls, we call that depreciation if it's a flexible exchange rate. Now, if it's a more fixed exchange rate and the government changes its value, then it's called a devaluation, or we say it's being devalued. If that's the case, then more units of it, say dollars, are needed to buy a single unit of some other currency, say euro. So if suddenly it costs more dollars to buy 1 euro, then the dollar is basically going down in value, it's depreciating. Well, that also means that the euro is going up in value, it is appreciating. So when a currency appreciates, or if it's more of a fixed exchange rate regime, it revalues. It's called revaluation. If you increase the value of a currency compared to another currency, then fewer units of it, if it's with the dollar-euro exchange rate, then it would be dollars, are needed to buy a single unit of some other currency, say euros. So if it takes less dollars to buy 1 euro, then clearly the dollar has appreciated. And of course, because it's a relative price, it means the euro has depreciated. Now, the central bank can get involved in exchange rates because it has a stockpile of foreign currencies, and of course the central bank itself can just print more of its own money if it needs to. So the central bank can offset the move in the currency by intervening in the market to buy or sell domestic currency to counteract whatever move occurs. So in other words, if we were operating under more of a fixed exchange rate regime and we started to see the dollar lose value against other currencies, then the central bank, in this case the Fed, could come in, intervene in the market and push the dollar back up. How would it do that? It would basically sell foreign currency and it would buy the dollar. And that would force the dollar to appreciate, basically, to offset the market depreciation. Now, let's just take that example. If the Fed, it's a hypothetical example because the Fed normally wouldn't do this, but if the Fed decided to intervene in the foreign exchange market, and in particular on the euro-dollar exchange rate, then if it wanted to stop the dollar from depreciating, in other words, as I just said, if the Fed decided to go into the market and start basically buying dollars and selling euros, that will obviously reduce the money supply because the Fed itself is buying dollars up. So those dollars were in the hands of private individuals, and now suddenly the Fed is buying them up. So the central bank can sterilize that kind of reduction in the money supply by doing an open market operation. In other words, basically by buying some government bonds in the bond market, and that will automatically increase the amount of money in circulation. So let's look at some of these different foreign exchange regimes. The first one we're going to look at is the crawling peg. Obviously, a fixed exchange rate is a fixed exchange rate, but most countries don't have fixed exchange rates per se. If they want something that's relatively constant, then they're going to probably use what we call a crawling peg. Now, the terminology that a lot of international economists use for fixed exchange rate is a pegged exchange rate. And the reason why is because, of course, back in the Victorian times, well, maybe a bit later than the Victorian times, but back when they first started to trade foreign exchange in properly organized exchanges, they had a board and they would write, it was like a blackboard, and it had holes in it where pegs would go. And basically the bid offer spread, obviously you're going to pay more if you're buying a foreign currency than if you're selling it. The bid offer spread was shown by pegs that were placed into the board, and basically the actual rates were written on the board like a blackboard. So a crawling peg exchange rate, it offers stability. Why? Because the peg is fixed for a certain period of time, so it doesn't change day to day, but it may change week to week, for instance. And this is typically what happens in China, by the way. China has a crawling peg exchange rate regime. Sometimes you get countries that actually change it daily. I don't agree with him there to say the rate doesn't change day to day. It can change day to day. It doesn't have to change day to day, but it can do. And sometimes this doesn't work. And there are two reasons why it might not work. First of all, bureaucracy. That is that the official exchange rate does not change as often as it should because the bureaucracy simply doesn't react fast enough. So in other words, you can get a situation where you have some event and the fixed exchange rate is still there. The peg hasn't been moved, and that can create a lot of problems because then individuals won't bother using the official exchange rates. They will basically go to the black market. Now that has been happening, by the way, in Venezuela. Venezuela officially has a flexible exchange rate, but the government effectively made it into a crawling peg type exchange rate, but doesn't change the peg very often. Why? Because there's such a big now unofficial market, black market one might call it, for the Venezuelan currency against the dollar. And then political pressure. There's often pressure on central banks to not devalue a currency. By devaluing a currency, in other words, moving the peg down so that the currency is worth less against other currencies, it's often seen as a negative sign for the country concerned, so the politicians tend not to like it. So weakening currency is often considered, wrongly as we know, as a sign of a country's economic weakness. So a good example of this type of foreign exchange regime would be the Chinese currency, which is fixed against the US dollar, but it does move on a weekly basis, usually sometimes more often, against the US dollar. Next one is the target zone. The target zone is kind of an equal combination of stability and flexibility. So instead of having a peg and then moving that peg, why not just have a band? So you can see that with a band, the currency can be flexible in terms of any rate that lies between the outer limits of your band. Now, as soon as you get to the outer limits of the band, so in other words, if you approach the upper bound or the lower bound, of the band, then the central bank will step in to the foreign exchange market and intervene. So if, for instance, the currency started to appreciate, but went too far and hit the upper band, so the upper bound of the band, if you like, then the central bank has to step in. It has to make the currency weaker. So how does it do that? It effectively sells the domestic currency and starts buying the foreign currency, whatever that is. So the increase in supply in the foreign exchange market pushes down the value of the currency. If the daily market determined exchange rate approaches the lower band, the other way around, in other words, then the central bank has to buy up its own currency, in other words, sell foreign currency. This is where we get into trouble in this situation, because what needs to happen is the central bank basically has to sell its own reserves of foreign currency. So all central banks have foreign exchange reserves. Sometimes the ownership of those is shared with the Treasury, as it is in the US. But basically, in that case, you're going to have to continue buying your own currency, in other words, selling those foreign exchange reserves. And the problem comes when you start to run out of those foreign exchange reserves. If you do, then you're going to have to change where the target zone is. In other words, you're going to have to what we call realign the target zone. An example of this might be the ERM of the EMS, the exchange rate mechanism of the European monetary system. The Europeans have this target zone system, where the target zone can move around. Of course, it also has the euro now, but countries are assumed to want to join the euro, and so at some point they all have to, if they're going to join the euro, use these target zones. In other words, use this what's so-called exchange rate mechanism. Here we're getting into a kind of interesting variant, once again, on a fixed exchange rate regime. So a currency board, in this case, is the idea that if you have so much in foreign exchange reserves, then automatically the amount of money supply you have in the country versus how much you have in these foreign exchange reserves dictates that there's a certain rate involved in terms of how much you have of your currency should be able to get per how much the foreign exchange reserves are. What that means then is if you're going to print more money, print more of your own money, you should only be able to do that if you have more of the foreign currency as well. So the monetary authority basically fixes the value of the currency and pledges by law that will convert its local currency to the anchor currency at any time. A good example of this is the Hong Kong dollar. So the Hong Kong dollar is convertible at pretty much a constant fixed rate into US dollars. It's a way to instill confidence in the country's currency. So in Hong Kong's case, you can't produce any more Hong Kong dollars unless you can produce more US dollars, because every Hong Kong dollar has to be convertible into US dollars. What does that do to the central bank? Of course, it completely ties the hands of the central bank. It means the central bank can't print any new money unless it has the currency to which the money is fixed to, in other words, Hong Kong dollars in this case. So the Hong Kong Monetary Authority can't print any more Hong Kong dollars unless it has more US dollars. And really what it does is it ties the central bank's hands, because the central bank and the currency bank are usually the same thing, and it basically means that whichever country you're talking about is pretty much tied in terms of what it can do monetarily. So, as I said, a good example of that would be the Hong Kong dollar. Another good example of that is Argentina, which with the real, the Argentinian real, no, peso, sorry, the Argentinian peso, they had a currency board against the US dollar in the late 80s, early 90s. Unfortunately, it collapsed. Now we're getting on to the float and managed float systems. So this is the other end of the spectrum. If we're looking at very flexible exchange rate regimes, a freely floating exchange rate regime is where the central bank or the government doesn't say anything about the currency value. It just lets it float in the market. In other words, just lets it be determined in the market and doesn't do anything to affect that determination. Most countries are not willing to completely go that far. They want some kind of security that if things need to be corrected, that they can go in and correct them and that they can have their central bank intervene. This is called a managed floating exchange rate regime. And there are different types of managed floating exchange rate regime. There's a so-called clean float and there's a dirty float. Now the clean float is basically free floating completely, and if there is any intervention then it's very transparent about what's going on, and often the announcement about when intervention will occur will be made in advance. Now a dirty float is completely the opposite. It's where the central bank doesn't tell anyone else when it's going to intervene. It just goes ahead and intervenes, and there's no specific policy announcement made about the circumstances in which it will intervene. So in a managed float system, the exchange rates generally are able to move to their equilibrium values. But, as I said, occasionally central banks do intervene in the foreign exchange market. It doesn't happen very often these days. It happened in the last century, in the 1980s in particular, and 1970s. It happened a lot more than it does now. Okay, so we've covered, several different exchange rate regimes. What are the advantages of each? And, what are the implications for monetary policy as well? Well, the fixed exchange rate type regime is advantageous for countries in particular that have monetary authorities, in other words, central banks, with a credibility problem. So in other words, if there's a credibility problem and people don't trust the central bank, they think it's just going to print more and more money, because it has in the past maybe, adopting a fixed exchange rate or a currency board or something like that is a good idea because it can enhance stability. How can it do that? Well, let's move to the second bullet point first. In fact, it can establish the central bank's credibility. And central banks, if they're going to be, if their policies are going to be effective, they need to have credibility. People have to believe what the central bank says. So going to something like a fixed exchange rate, currency board, enhances that kind of credibility. And, the other reason why, the first one bullet point there, is helping to end financial crises. Typically, developing countries in particular try and end financial crises by going to something that's fixed and usually against a currency that's extremely stable. So the Mexican peso crisis in the 1990s, it was stabilized by basically the Mexicans decided to fix their currency against the US dollar for a period of time. That fixed exchange currency can soothe a flight to quality. In other words, just to get out of the currency altogether, if you've got something fixed and the government stands, and the central bank stands behind that, that tends to offer some kind of credibility, if you like, to the country or central bank, some kind of assurance that things are not going to go to pot. Now, in particular in Europe, they've moved towards the idea of having a euro. Now, this came from work that was done by Robert Mundell. Robert Mundell is a Nobel Prize winning Canadian economist. And, he looked at the idea of when should a country give up its own currency and use someone else's currency. There are various countries already that have done that. So, for instance, Panama is dollarized now. It's given up its own currency effectively and uses the US dollar. Same with Ecuador. Same with Zimbabwe, north of South Africa. Same with several of the Caribbean islands, by the way. So, one solution here might be to create all economies to have a fixed exchange rate with each other. The fixed exchange rate eventually can be fixed to the new currency, which can then be used to replace all individual currencies. That is the idea behind the euro, of course. And the euro was introduced by first fixing exchange rates of the different EU countries against the euro. Now, Robert Mundell, the guy who brought up this idea of the optimal currency area, tried to look at, when is it in a country's interest to go to or adopt another currency from another country, go to a common currency. And he came up with several criteria which he felt needed to be in place before that could work effectively. The first requirement is labor mobility. The reason why is that if you don't have an exchange rate that you can move around, then something else has to move around to replace it. So here are some of the things. Labor mobility. So in other words, if there's a part of the country that's not doing well, then people have to be able to move away from that part of the country. If there's a part of the country that's booming and it needs workers like crazy, then people need to be able to move into that area. Excuse me. Capital mobility. So money needs to be able to move between the areas, for similar reasons as for labor mobility. If there are certain opportunities for growth in a certain area, then money needs to be able to flow from one area to another. So if Texas is booming, we need money to be able to flow into Texas from California and Montana and New York and other places. Wage and price flexibility. The idea here is that if wages and prices get out of whack between different parts of a single currency area, like considering in the US, then labor will flow if the wage differential is big enough between various parts of the country. But you need to have that flexibility in there so that areas that are really growing rapidly can have wages and prices that are going up rapidly in those areas. You can't really contain those wages and prices if the economy is booming, and similarly if it's going into bust, you need to have wages and prices being able to fall. You also, because of course, different parts of the country could go into a recession. Now, if you had your own currency, you would just depreciate the thing like crazy. In other words, let it fall. But if you're using a common currency, if you're using, say, the euro in Europe, then there's no way to offset if you go into a depression or a recession. So the way in which to do that is to have coordinated fiscal policy. In other words, to have fiscal policy ideally at the federal level. In the European context, they don't call it federal, they call it supranational. supranational level. So that's where tax and spend needs to be, which it isn't in Europe, by the way, to make things work. Now, as it isn't in Europe, then the second best kind of option is to go to coordination of fiscal policy between the countries, so that there's a limit on what any one country can do. We have that in the US as well, by the way. Most states are not allowed to run a budget deficit. Only the federal government is allowed to run a budget deficit. And, as it says here, the optimal currency area, or it's often known as OCA, can be applied to the United States as well. The last part of this chapter deals with international institutions. So first of all, a little bit of history. After World War II, there was a desire to set up global institutions to effectively mediate and collectivize economic development. One of the reasons why we had the world wars was because everyone was doing their own thing, and there wasn't kind of a lot of communication between countries as there is now. And so certain countries decided, well, we're going to go do our own thing, Germany in particular. And of course, then they got Hitler involved, and Adolf Hitler, decided that Germany needed to be taking over the parts of Europe that had been German or did have German speakers. So that meant taking over Czech Republic and Poland as well, and so became very expansionary, as we know, and that caused the Second World War. So after the Second World War, there was an agreement that there needs to be a talking shop. But not just that, there needs to be a way to help countries that get into trouble. And so the initial idea was at Bretton Woods. Bretton Woods is a ski resort in New Hampshire, as you know. And Bretton Woods, the discussion was, what kind of institutions do we need to be able to for that to happen? So the IMF was set up, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and originally they had envisioned an international trade organization, which they call the ITO. The ITO actually never happened. Instead, as we know, we got the GATT. However, later on, of course, the WTO happened, which, was the kind of child of ITO. So WTO now has happened. So we do have kind of three different institutions post-World War II now to deal with different aspects of the global economy. We're going to see how that works. The top picture there, by the way, is the IMF headquarters in Washington, D.C., and the second one, the bottom there on the left, that's the World Bank headquarters in Washington too. Now, the World Trade Organization, as you know from a previous chapter, is based in Geneva, Switzerland, so it's not based in the US. So let's quickly talk about the World Bank. It's now called the World Bank Group. It comprises actually of 5 different agencies, and the World Bank as such is just the umbrella organization. I think we did this in the previous chapter, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but you can see the different parts there of the World Bank. And basically the World Bank is governed by a board of governors, and the World Bank was quite controversial in the 1970s. Why? Because it seemed to be giving loans for all sorts of big projects. Now the World Bank has completely turned that on its head, and although you can go to the World Bank for large projects, it now is putting a lot more emphasis on micro loans. That is giving loans to, for instance, women's groups or businesses that are trying to get set up things. So trying to do more kind of hands-on at a much lower level than just basically funding things like dams or roads. Now, the IMF was originally created as a result of an understanding that two of the major causes of the Great Depression were the collapse of the global financial system and the instability of the value of currencies. So part of the role of the main role of the IMF was originally envisaged as loaning money to governments to address macroeconomic issues. And those macroeconomic issues had to be what they called balance of payments problems. That basically meant that if you were running a huge trade deficit, then there was clearly a problem, and you were going to have to do something with your currency, depreciated obviously, to stimulate your deficit, so it's not nearly as bad. And the IMF's role in that was basically to try and make sure that that this was all done fairly and funds were available to borrow, particularly when you did get into a big balance of payments issue. They also encouraged countries to float their currency and not use the currency to try and stimulate growth. And that's called the beggar thy neighbor currency policy. Beggar thy neighbor basically means that you depreciate your currency, you devalue if it's a more fixed rate type of regime that you're using, and that basically stimulates your exports and essentially improves your balance of payments by improving your trade balance. However, due to high inflation in the US in the late 60s, that was due to the money that was being spent on the Vietnam War and the United States' failure to allow the dollar to depreciate. The US didn't want the currency to depreciate. The rest of the world eventually stopped absorbing dollars and started to exchange US dollars for gold. Under Bretton Woods, the US dollar was tied to gold and everything else was tied to the US dollar. Now, if countries started losing faith in the US dollar, then clearly they wanted to get out of the US dollars. Well, many of them were holding large amounts of US dollars, so they were converting it into gold. So what it meant is that gold was gaining in value because there was a demand for gold, and the US dollar was losing in value against gold. So in other words, the dollar was basically in trouble. It was going down in value. In August 1971, with the US gold reserves decreasing, in other words, when these countries came and wanted actual gold for their US dollars, the US had to supply that gold. So it could only go on for so long without changing the amount of ounces of gold you got for a dollar. But President Nixon in 1971 essentially ended the gold standard and moved to try to shore it up something a little similar but not quite the same, which lasted until 1973. And then 1973, Bretton Woods' exchange rate system collapsed, where these currencies were fixed against each other, and we went to a fully floating exchange rate regime. So the IMF, its whole purpose was to lend to countries that were having problems under a type of fixed exchange rate regime. So the IMF had to find some kind of new reason for existing, raison d'etre, as one might say in French. The IMF, I think, has successfully done that. It's changed its focus considerably. So the IMF now basically lends to countries that get into trouble for whatever reason, and not just for balance of payments problems. There were some that didn't like that and said that the IMF was basically doing mission creep. So we obviously saw problems with the World Bank as well, particularly in the 1980s. The World Bank came up against a lot of criticism, and this was because the World Bank was accused of basically giving out foreign aid and essentially supporting countries that were adopting protectionist type policies. So the World Bank changed its focus considerably, and its focus now is on providing technical assistance and financing to create a finished goods sector in the developing countries. So, in other words, most developing countries effectively were agrarian economies, certainly post-World War II, but many of them have grown into being industrial manufacturing countries. Think about China, India, and basically the World Bank tried to make sure that they had access to funding to build the infrastructure and build the finished goods sector as well, so that they could actually produce complete goods in those countries rather than just the raw materials. There is the accusation that's been leveled at the World Bank of not giving enough weight to infrastructure development and long-term poverty alleviation. In other words, trying to come up with schemes to make sure that people actually have jobs and are not starving. The main problem that we saw with the IMF in particular, and this came up in the 1980s as well, was that the IMF basically has been lending to certain countries, and those countries have become kind of almost addicted to the help that the IMF has on offer, like a drug addict going to the same junkie, as one economist described it. The IMF is important here as well for some countries, because without IMF lending, then private investors often will not invest in a country, and they will not lend to a country. So for a country, it's often very important to get that IMF loan, or be approved by the IMF for a loan at least, for other money to flow. One of the problems we have seen with money lent to undesirable type leaders is that if the IMF lends them money, sometimes they never see that money, or they'll never see that money again because the leader has spent it on bribes for his people. By the way, these two organizations, the World Bank and the IMF, are often referred to as the sisters. Institutionally, they share the same structure. They have voting rights that are based on quotas in each country, and there's a supermajority of 85% for most significant changes in policy. So it's not just a majority on committees. Often you'll have to have this 85% barrier, so 60% won't be enough to pass something. The US controls about 16.5% of quotas, and quotas are the voting means to vote. And nothing can get done by the World Bank or the IMF without the US approval. The US basically funded and set up these organizations initially after World War II, because the rest of the world was in complete tatters. Even the UK, which was on the same side as the US, was in a terrible state after the Second World War. So the US set these things up, but made sure it had a lot of control over what happened, which is fair enough. I mean, if you're giving the money to set these things up to begin with, then obviously you want to make sure that you have control over what happens. So in 2010, IMF quotas were doubled and shifted more of the quotas to emerging nations. So quotas are basically what you have to contribute, but at the same time, a lot of the lending that's permitted to any country is dependent on the amount of quotas that you have. And that's also the voting rights as well. So your representation in the organization determines how much you can get out of the organization as well. So some say the IMF and the World Bank have become too big and too complex and answer to no one. Developing countries are very wary and accuse the sisters, accuse them both of following what is called the Washington Consensus, which means that the developed countries, what they want, as they control most of the power. So what that means is that, and certainly this was a big criticism in the 1990s as well, with the IMF, was that the policies that countries had to follow in order to get a loan were very much made by the US Treasury, that people felt. And of course the US Treasury is in Washington, and therefore it was the Washington Consensus at play. Here are some critical thinking questions. Very briefly, Bretton Woods Conference held in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, was organized to create the groundwork for a new international monetary system. What was the outcome? Well, the outcome was obviously 2 out of the 3 organizations were set up, the IMF and the World Bank. So in that sense, it was successful. How did the crawling peg system of exchange rates work? Or how does it work? Well, it's a fix and then it's altered periodically. That fix is moved. It can be on a weekly basis, it could be on a daily basis. It's rarely on a daily basis. But it's more likely to be on the basis of when the government wants to do it. Which economies would benefit the most from having a monetary union, or stated slightly differently, under what conditions would a group of economies benefit the most from having a single currency? One of the things that's clear is that if you trade a lot with another country, then you don't really want to have a different currency. Why? Because there's another cost then involved in doing trade with that country, because you constantly have to be changing your money into their money and vice versa. So countries that are very close to each other do a lot of trade with each other, and they are likely to benefit most from monetary union. Is there another currency in the world that the group of economies have their own currency? There is not right now. Basically, the euro is the one currency that's representative for all the European countries. Well, not all of them, but a subset of them. There is actually one other that I can think of, which is the West African Monetary Union, and they use the euro basically as their currency. So it's basically a monetary union as well. And here we have a summary. So thank you for listening.